Kathleen, thanks for making the time to speak with me today.
Thanks for the invitation.
I was intrigued by your website, by one line that said that you have spent a career, or began your career at least, with a love for the wet, wild world of rivers and tidal places and islands, I think that was the other thing. I'm intrigued by that. How is it that you began there?
I grew up in Cleveland, of all places, but my father was the natural history field trip coordinator for a museum along this little circle of river that went around Cleveland. So even though we lived right at the western approach to the Hopkins Airport, and even though that we could see the rising towers in Cleveland, we had this little tiny wilderness with a river going through it, Rocky River, and that's where I grew up every weekend wading in that river.
Oh my, what a childhood. Well, that's an interesting idea though, that you don't have to go to Alaska to find wild little stretches of river or mountains or whatever. Your story suggests, no, you can find it anywhere.
You can, although as soon as I was married, we left. And my husband said, why don't you apply for graduate school? I said, where? He said, anywhere there's a river with trout. So I applied in Colorado and Washington and Oregon, and we ended up in Colorado and all of those beautiful rivers. And then we went to Oregon, which is a heaven of rivers. And now we spend our summers in Alaska, where two bear trails and a creek meet the tidal flat. So in every possible way, we've looked for wet, wild places.
But it must have also intrigued you professionally. I mean, you've spent a career thinking about what it means to have healthy and vibrant, wet and wild places. Why? What was it about that that attracted you?
Well, you know, I am two things. I am a philosopher, a philosophy professor, and I am a natural history writer, a nature writer, we call ourselves. They speak to the same thing, I think, which is developing a responsible relationship with the place so that you can openly learn about it and it can openly inform you, and you feel this moral urgency of protecting it. So wet places, why wet places? I think probably because you can float on them. They ask so little and give so much.
Yeah, that's an interesting phrase, asking so little and giving so much. Well, I would like to know really what it means to be an environmental philosopher. That's not two words that we hear together very often. We hear environmental activism, environmental science, but environmental philosophy, what is that?
Well, you're right. There wasn't such a thing. And in fact, in graduate school, I was told there was not such a thing. But in about the same time, just past Earth Day, there was one person who started doing it at Colorado State University. And then it became a center for the study of right relationship with the natural world. What is the natural world? What does it mean to treat it well? What does it mean to understand your relationship to it? Or the three obvious questions that we always ask ourselves because we're philosophers. Number one, what is the world? Number two, what is the place of a human in the world? And number three, how then shall I live?
Okay, so those are nice, easy questions. Just go ahead and give us your answers.
Okay. Well,
well, what is the world then? Really, most people do not think in terms like this. They're born, they live, they work, they raise a family. They don't contemplate a question like that.
And underneath their lives is this huge chasm that is determining everything that they do and buy and see, which is this conflict between people who think that the earth is commodities, inanimate, created for human use, dirt, worthless, animals, senseless, and that our role is to exploit until there's nothing left. We are kings, and we're smart, and we can figure out how to live without the detritus of this planet. And on the other hand, those who think that this earth is sacred, that it's giving us extraordinary gifts, for which in return we owe debts of gratitude and caretaking, and that we, being living on a finite planet, need to act with restraint, and that our primary moral relationship with the earth then is one of reciprocity and regeneration. So when you say, question number one, what is the world? You get right into it right away. And your answer to that question is really determinant of how you live.
And which of those camps you perhaps grew up in? You know, you laid out this dualistic idea of humans as dominators versus humans as partners.
I grew up in the latter world. I grew up in a world that just invited me to awe and wonder. You know, my father leading these field trips would have to go out on Saturday, the day before, and explore a place very thoroughly, and he would take my sisters and I along, and we would pick up the logs to find the salamanders, we would locate the hummingbird nests, we would look for the fossils along the river, and then on Sunday, when my father came back with this group of searchers, he would be a magician. Maybe if you looked under that log, you would find a salamander. So that was my father's influence as a botanist and a scientist, and my mother was a science educator. Her contribution was the school garden, to invite students to go out into the world and dig in the dirt and learn about the soil and what makes food nourishing. So between them, I came out with a great deal of love and respect and delight in the natural world.
But others grew up in a very different environment with parents who are working at the factory. And I'm not being disparaging at all. That's the life that they had. That's the living that they made. Is it possible to move from one camp to another? Is it possible to say, okay, all I've ever known is this extractive idea. Now I'm going to know and be something different?
I don't know the answer to your question. I do know people who have grown up in the city with family that made their living by extraction, who are some of the most avid earth lovers I have ever met. I don't know any who have moved in the opposite direction, but that's because I don't know them. I don't live in those circles. But let me tell you that I think that we've been for 300 years engaged in this experiment to test which of those worldviews is correct. And I think that the results of that experiment are in. And I think it's very clear that living as if everything had no spirit, no worth except to us, no limits to the extraction, has led us to a disaster looming unless we act. And so I think the results are in, and we now know that we need to live with some respect and restraint. So the answer to your question about whether people can move from one worldview to another is, I really hope so.
What we really need to.
Yeah, we have to.
And so even if that hasn't been our way until now, it's time to learn.
I think so.
And so are there things that you see in your work and in your experience that give you hope that we're on the verge of doing that? That this, because you say these words, the evidence is in, it's clear that we've done damage to the points of calling into question our future. Well, to some people, that's not clear. They would argue that that's not clear at all. There's competing ways of looking at things. There's certainly competing messaging, let's put it that way.
There are wonderful surveys out from the Yale Climate Communication Center that talk about that and ask people what their views are. And it turns out that there's one group of people who are the absolute flat-out climate deniers, and they constitute about 9% of the population in the United States. That is precisely the population of people who think that Elvis is still alive. I don't worry about them. I'm more worried about the people who are concerned or very concerned or frightened. Those are the ones I want to talk about, because those are the people we need to count on to make a change.
The swing voters, so to speak, the ones that occupy that vast middle. And so how do you go about speaking to those people that are, okay, they'll go with you there to say they're concerned, but that's a long way from the kind of lifestyle change that would actually make a difference.
It's true, and that's really hard. And my approach is to try very hard to think about the people I'm going to be speaking to or writing about and asking myself, what is it that they love the most dearly? The answer is fairly clear. Their children, their legacy, and the wild earth. So if I can help them understand that love isn't just a kind of la-di-da, that to love something is to value it beyond your own life and to defend your life to its defense. So if we can begin with this shared love of, say, our children, and then we can talk about the consequences of our disregard for the very beings we love like life, then we can start asking the question that people are always asking me, what can I do? What can I do? That doesn't transform people, but maybe transformation isn't what we're looking for. What it can do is it can move people from inaction to a little bit of action, from no change to a little bit of change. And by that means, I think we can make some forward motion.
Well, and things like that tend to gather momentum.
They do.
I think about the civil rights movement. Little bits of change were happening, and then suddenly we had a big change. So there's precedent for that. You have said that you think the arts play a big role in this conversation, in environmental education. Why?
I do. Well, being a writer, a creative writer, people are often asking me, what's the use of art to this kind of struggle? Art, And I always quote Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche said, we have art in order not to die of the truth. Well, let's think about that. What truths now are we facing that will kill us, paralyze us, make it impossible for us to move forward? Those seem to me to be the facts of extinction and this looming catastrophe of the climate, the terrible injustice of it. How does art save us from that? I think as art allows us to see it without dying. So you remember Perseus and Medusa? All right. So Medusa, had the terrible snaky hair and was so ugly that if anyone looked at her, they would turn to stone. Not unlike climate change. If you look directly at climate change and extinction, you can be paralyzed in inaction.
Quite a few people are.
Yes. Perseus comes flying in on his winged sandals with his magic sword and his magic shield. And his genius is to not look at Medusa, but to hold his shield in such a way that he can see her reflection. And then looking at her reflection, he reaches out with his sword and cuts off her head. Well, that's what I think the arts can do. We can't look directly at climate change, perhaps, without turning to stone. But the arts can come along and represent the situation. They can show us what we're losing. They can show us in a way that is not exactly a mirror image, but is something that we can take in, so they can open our hearts without breaking them, and perhaps allow us to see what's true without becoming immobilized.
And do you think that that's happening? Are we seeing art come out of this crisis? I'm trying to think of examples myself, and I really can't think of any. Are there things that you would point to and say, here's a good example of what I'm talking about?
Yes. Where shall I start? Let me just give you a personal example.
Okay.
My university just cut down a grove of trees. The oldest one was 420 years old. That's when Descartes was born. That's when Shakespeare was writing Much Ado About Nothing. They would not promise not to cut any more old growths. So we got together and made a memorial service funeral. We invited a couple hundred people. There was poetry, there was music, there was beautiful photography, there was creative writing, there were flowers. All of the ways that we make art came together in this memorial service. The very next morning, the university pledged not to cut any more old trees ever. So there was the clearest example and the fastest example I have ever seen of how art makes social change overnight, literally.
And these were, I'm guessing, local poets and local musicians.
They were.
These weren't national acts that you had to line up to come in to do a special concert. These were people who cared deeply about the place.
And they were children.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine the benediction a child would write? May the forests be safe, and when I'm afraid, may I come to the old grandmother trees, and will they hold me in their arms? A child.
Mm-hmm.
So even the children are making art, especially the children are making art. Mm-hmm. And I think it does have an effect.
Mm-hmm. We're here in Sedona at a conference that was organized by the Natural History Institute. And I've talked with Tom a lot and love his vision and his philosophy. I find that there are people who don't really understand what natural history really is. They're still stuck in grade school, and the trip to the Natural History Museum was all about the dioramas. And
the bones.
Yeah, you know. Tell us your idea of what that concept is, what that means, natural history, and why it matters.
Interesting that it's called natural history. I'm sure that some people know the origin of that, as opposed to, say, human history, which recounts the train of events. Natural history would recount the train of events, but I don't think that's what it means anymore. I don't think it means these trays with dead birds in them, or as you say, the dinosaur skeletons. In many ways, I think it's affective. In many ways, I think it has more to do with appreciating, seeing, recognizing, and loving the wild things around you and the way they interact, the genius of them and the beauty of them and the example of them. So in my mind, a natural history person is someone who studies the world without cutting it up. Cutting it up in the sense of not chopping it into, well, these are trees, these are bushes, these are, gymnosperms and so forth. We're not cutting up, like dissecting it and assuming that its parts have anything to do with the whole. So maybe it's holistic in that sense, that it's a non-destructive view of the entirety of things.
And is it by necessity participatory as well?
Rachel Carson would say so. She would say that the science is the soil, and that it's important for our children, all of us, to really understand what nourishes life, but that wonder grows in that soil. So I think in some ways natural history is going to have a part of both of them, right? It's going to give you, okay, this is a ponderosa pine and you can distinguish it from a white fir in this way, that kind of knowledge. But from that, I think natural history would try to encourage the sense of, I didn't know it worked that way, how magnificent. That is absolutely stunning.
Here's what a ponderosa needs versus what a white pine needs, and here's why I need them both.
And here's how they go about, unbeknownst to us, fulfilling each other's needs. And then there is that sapsucker and the insects and so forth.
Yeah. It seems to me that what we've been talking about this entire time is really not just fiddling around the edges and tweaking sort of how we've been doing business with science and philosophy, but a whole new way of looking at things, at least from a Western perspective. Indigenous peoples have known that sort of second path that you talked about earlier of what is the world? Well, it's a partnership, it's a family. We haven't. How hard is it going to be to really
No, not that hard. For the first time that I know of, science, ecosystem science, and all the religions of the world, except perhaps the monotheistic ones, and all of the indigenous cultures are saying the same thing. They're calling us all to the same attention, and that is to the interrelationships among things and the kinship of all beings. So we've got, let's talk about confluences, we've got these great threads coming together to confirm this great flood of insight. So I think it's on us. I think that people are starting to understand in real ways. And now Tom has added medicine to that river. So when we start to think about what's most important to us, which often is our very own well-being, we realize it too is part of this whole, and it too flows in that same river.
Well, and the realization that we're not well in so many ways.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this term, reciprocal healing, the title of this, I guess it's the subtitle of the conference that we're attending.
Yeah.
That implies that healing is necessary in both directions. So much of environmental activism is about healing the earth, healing the earth. It's been refreshing to hear, no, we have some healing to do ourselves. My question to you is, what do we need to heal in ourselves in order to activate this reciprocity that we've been talking about?
Egoism, the notion that we are the center of the universe. Solipsism, the notion that we're the only ones, that our seeing is the only seeing that there is. Exceptionalism, the notion that we are the pinnacle of all creation. All these isms, individualism, this notion that I can thrive alone. All this legacy of the Enlightenment, all the legacy of this philosopher, Rene Descartes, who was born when that poor tree that we cut down was born. And other influences as well, including how convenient all those isms are for the big ism, which is capitalism. Yeah, you got me. Got ahead of me there. Exactly. I don't know whether that's the disease or if that's the cause of the disease, but I do think that recognizing them and trying really hard to renounce them is part of the cure. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that one way to reach out to people and find common ground is to think about what they love. Love is a powerful motivator, but so is fear. How do you talk to people who are mostly just afraid? They're afraid of not being able to pay the rent. They're afraid of medical bankruptcy. They're afraid of what this culture is doing to their children. How do you elevate the conversation with people like that to get them to think about these isms and so forth when everyone in this culture just seems to be suffering from fear so strongly?
If I were to design a society in which I would be free to make as much money as possible, to slough off all the consequences on innocent people, to not give a darn about their suffering, and then to claim that I am an Übermensch, a marvelous human being, the super capitalist, if I wanted to create that world, I would create a world in which people were absolutely insecure, where they may or may not have a job, where they may or may not have the rent money, where they may or may not be able to pay medical care. And I would do that because, number one, they would rely on me for whatever pittances I might drop in their labs. And number two, I could probably convince them to blame themselves. And then I could do whatever I wanted to do. And I don't know whether it's by chance or more probably by design that the system that we're in now empowers the rich to become richer by disempowering those people and making them think day to day. So they don't have a luxury for change. So let me tell you a story, okay?
Please.
This is my little grandson. He's 11 years old. And he comes and he says, "Nani, I'm trying really hard not to love the world. I'm trying really hard not to care about it at all." Well, why is that, Theo? Because I have learned that by the time I'm middle-aged, I'll be dead. And I don't want to be sad about that. And I was just enraged. You know how a grandparent gets. I said, "No, Theo, you will be alive. It's the underprivileged children, the poor children who will be dead or dying or in terrible peril of dying. And your job right now is to stay alive, to learn as much as you can, to get as many skills as you can and as strong a spirit as you can, so that you can go out there and you can save those children and you can save a world that's worth living in now." So when you talk about fear, I feel that very personally and intensely. But I also know that fear can drive us towards action to keep people safe. I guess that's what I want to say.
Well, it's something that I think about because so long as people are afraid, and they have no reason to not be afraid, it's a little tough to get them to think about the esoteric.
May I quarrel with the question? When you think about around the world, the great activists to protect the environment, the jungle, the great forests, water supplies, soil from Monsanto to all the great efforts, very successful sometimes, are by the poorest, most desperate people. They're not privileged, they're not rich, they're not donating to Sierra Club. They're on the ground saving what saves their lives. So when people say that environmentalism is elitist, I say you haven't been outside of Marin County.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, I love it when people quarrel with my questions. So just go right ahead.
That's what philosophers do. That's the definition of our business.
And so, this confluence.
Yeah.
We're here to talk about confluence, and I love that because you've already mentioned that we're hearing the same thing from so many voices now. What identify some of the threads that you see coming together in a powerful way that have the potential to become greater than the sum of their parts, perhaps now? What are those threads?
Well, we're only in the second day of the conference, but already we're seeing the theme of kinship emerge, the theme that we are all connected, that human beings might think of themselves as who's sitting here, but that in fact is just only part. The wonderful Indigenous man, Jack Forbes, said, you know, I could cut off my ear and I would still live. I could cut off my nose and I would still live. I could cut off my hands and I would still live. But if you cut off the air, I would die. If you cut off the sunshine, I would die. So why do I think that my hands and my ears are more part of me than the air and the sun? That's a beautiful way to say it, I think.
Very much is,
Yeah.
yes. What do you fear?
When? Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, or Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays? What do I feel about the climate crisis?
What do you fear?
Oh, fear.
Fear. What? We talked about people who are living in a state of fear, and that tends to dominate their choices. One way or the other, you've made a great point that sometimes that motivates you to take great action. What do you fear?
Well, I fear for my grandchildren. I absolutely fear that they will come into a world where the life-supporting systems of the planet are irretrievably damaged. Water, agriculture. I fear, oh, dear Lord, I fear for migrating shorebirds. 78% decline in my lifetime. And all the other extinctions, I fear for those small creatures. I think about it all the time. When I don't hear them, I'm afraid. When I do hear them, I'm sorry. It possesses me. By the time, oh, I just don't know, let me put it differently. It will take 5 to 7 million years for the earth to recover the abundance it lost during my lifetime. Unbelievable. And how will the children live without birdsong? How will they find solace in a world that doesn't have wild oaks and pigeons? That makes me very afraid. I've heard the argument from Carl Safina that it's silly to talk about the worth of animals in terms of what they do for us, because he couldn't think of a single endangered species that could not go extinct without having very little effect on human well-being. A couple fewer ocelots or no ocelots at all, what does that matter to you and to me, really, in terms of our well-being? And he says, that's not the point. It's not that the animals are useful to us or not useful to us. It's what they ask of us, not what they give to us. So the real reason to be so concerned about wild animals is that they're crying out in need, and that to be a human being is to be responsive to that need. So the largest reason to save the animals and to work so hard on that is that they need us. And I thought that was right. That was a beautiful appeal to integrity. But the premise that we don't need the animals, I simply did not agree with. It may not be morally relevant, but it's certainly emotionally relevant. I mean, just being here and waking up to the sounds of the bluebirds and the robins in the morning.
Well, and it's difficult to predict what the consequences might be of a species going extinct.
Yeah.
The great analogy that I always love is, how many rivets can you take out of an airplane before it won't fly anymore? And it's just that one more, perhaps, that causes the whole thing to fall apart.
Yes, or the metaphor that I like is, we're like people who live in the tower of a penthouse, and every day we send people down to the basement to take out a brick to make our apartment more beautiful and more decorated and lovely. And we might be able to do that every day for 100 days, maybe for 100 years. But at some point, the whole edifice will collapse, and our position at the top will not save us.
Is it possible to know where we are in that process?
I don't know where we are, but I do know that 11,000 scientists just issued a warning in Science Magazine, in The Guardian, saying that, you know, this is an all-out emergency. It is all hands on deck. We are headed straight for those tipping points, and there will be no return. They're not talking 100 years from now. And that's the big mistake the scientists made, is to think that this was going to move so slowly as they anticipated. It's faster in every respect.
Well, I remember that when the first IPCC reports began to come out, it was easy for everyone to ignore them. 2100, what does that even mean? And it turned out to be a decade instead.
Yeah.
So we've talked about what you fear. What gives you hope?
I'm not sure I welcome hope. I'm not sure that hope is what we need. I look at it this way. If you have great hope that everything is going to be fine regardless of what I do, I don't have to do anything. If I have complete despair, if I think that everything is going to be terrible no matter what I do, I don't have to do anything. Hope, blind hope, blinding despair, I don't have to do anything. So both of those, I think, allow us to escape our responsibilities. So the problem is that that's a false dichotomy, right? That's a logical fallacy, because between hope and despair is this great middle ground that we call integrity. To do what's right because we believe it's right, not because we think it's going to get us something, not because we think we can save the world, but at least we can be doing what we think is right. We can live simply because we believe in living simply. We can act lovingly toward the world because we love it. And I think that's what we're called to do.
All right, well, let me rephrase the question, and I will tweak the language, because I was once corrected by someone I respected that there's a vast difference between hope and optimism. Hope you can hang on to no matter what. But to be optimistic, you have to have a reason. Is there anything that makes you optimistic?
Okay, so I agree with you that optimism is hope with data. Hope with data. So you have some evidence that things are going to turn out the way you hope they will. Yes. I'm not a scholar of hopeful things. My work is mostly on moral obligations in the face of despair. There are technologies that I think might help. There's an increasing understanding that the world is out there to help us, that this world has all sorts of mechanisms of repair and carbon sequestration and everything else, that if you ever want a powerful ally, you got one, and it's the Earth. I take some hope in the way people are turning up the heat on the oligarchs and the people who would extract us all to death. So I think there are reasons to be hopeful. But I think that Barbara Kingsolver had a very good point when she said, if you run out of hope at the end of the day, get up in the morning and put it on with your shoes. That makes me think that hope is more an act of will than an act of evidence. So I choose to be hopeful. I think I have an obligation to choose to be hopeful, because hope is what gets us up in the morning. Yeah.
Well, we're out of time, but people may watch this interview who are new to some of these ideas. They're coming to it for the first time. What words would you leave them with?
I think I would say that our obligation to the world is to love it, and to understand that love is not a la-di-da. Love is a sacred trust, and to love something is to affirm its absolute worth and to devote your life to its thriving, fiercely, forever.
Well, let me say, I love that. Kathleen, thanks for the time and the conversation. I've enjoyed it very much.
You're welcome.